Okay, go.
Hey, I'm on today with Marty Duren, who's been a friend of mine for a long time, and Todd Littleton and Paul Littleton as well. Todd is a pastor in Oklahoma, and Paul has been a pastor for many years and is an involved a layman and leader in his church. And we're here to talk about today an article that Marty wrote just this past week that was on Lifeway.com called "Dealing with Loss, Grief, and Grace in a Pandemic." And I saw this and just want to reach out to Marty and reach out to Todd and Paul as well. Thought we could have a good conversation about what is going on from a pastoral perspective, both as pastors as well as church members and family members and friends, and just kind of working through what's happening. We hear the news about those who are suffering loss, and of course those who are getting sick and going through that, and potential deaths that are beginning to add up. But there's also another kind of loss that's happening. There's a loss of our daily rhythm and routines, and just the things that we go through. I know I'm thinking about my own family and my son who's a high school senior, and how a lot of that rhythm of life and those milestones are being either canceled or changed. And so I saw this article by Marty, and I saw him begin to address some of these things. And I just want to ask you, Marty, what prompted you to write about this? What got you thinking about kind of the daily losses that we go through, and how did you process that in your own mind to write this?
Well, it started with me actually before the coronavirus stuff hit, because our community had just gone through a tornado March 3rd. So overnight on March 3rd, several tornadoes came through the Nashville area, starting on the west side and continuing through to about 60 miles down the road. And we had a lot of destruction, and that was on a Tuesday. So our church facility was opened up and people were coming in and out all week long, getting food and all that. So the next Sunday, which would have been the first Sunday of March, was a pretty somber time for all the churches in our community, really. We had a couple of church buildings destroyed and people, scattered, and 4 schools damaged. And so we already had school issues before coronavirus hit in our community. So that next Sunday, which I guess was the 7th maybe, we had an opportunity to just kind of speak into it as a church. And so I've been thinking about lamentations and grief, and the need to let grief have its work, that grief is a gift from God. It's not something that we should avoid, although it's something we often do avoid. I would say that we don't avoid grief because you can't avoid that, but we avoid grieving. We avoid the emotional outlet that grief demands of us. And so we talked about that a lot. When coronavirus comes around, and it's a different kind of thing. People aren't, their houses aren't destroyed, their schools aren't destroyed, but it's the same sense of loss when you can't get together with people. Graduations are being postponed, and really important social events are being either canceled or postponed. And so it just seemed like grief was welling up nationally, bit by bit. And so that led to the article itself.
Mm-hmm. And, I'm just thinking myself about how I've been processing this, and it doesn't hit all at once. With
Right.
this, you hear about, okay, there's a virus is coming, and there's a shelter-in-place order, that is given to try to protect you, and things like that. And you say, oh, okay, do we have enough food in the cupboard? Do we have gas in the car? Or are we ready for this? So a couple of weeks, that seems like a long time, and you're not even really processing what you had planned for 2 weeks from now, or what's being lost. And it kind of hits you in waves, or it hits you just at different times. Paul, I just wanted to ask you, you're not pastoring right now per se, but yet you're involved in church, and and you've done this before. You might just have a perspective. How are people around you kind of processing this, and what are your thoughts about how to handle the things that come one at a time, that as you kind of become aware of it?
Yeah, there are a couple of impacts. I've got a coworker who texted us all on our team last night and said that his dad is feeling bad, running a fever, and he's concerned. Don't know at this point what it is. And, in the normal routine of life, you just think, well, he's got a cold, or he's maybe got the flu, and he'll get over it and we'll move on down the road. But now it's the kind of event that you text your coworkers about and say, hey, I'm concerned, and could you pray for my family. I'm personally in a similar situation with you, Alan. I've got a daughter who's a senior in college, and they're not going to have a graduation ceremony. And then later, at the end of May, she's supposed to get married. And, 22 years ago when we had her, I never envisioned that she might have to have an alternate plan for what her wedding is going to look like when that day comes, and not have grandparents there, and not have her friends who she's shared life with there for one of the really important events in life. So um, I it probably on some level bothers me more than it does her. And I have to hold back my tears sometimes thinking about what that will be like in a month.
Yeah, I keep checking in on my son and saying, "How are you doing?" And he's worked so hard. He's like, "I'm fine, I'm good," And
Yeah.
I'm like, "Well, I'm not good. Can you help me through this a little bit?" Because I wanted to see you walk across the stage and share that with you. And of course, we'll find some other way to celebrate it, but it'll be different. Todd, what are you just in this processing of grief and as you're talking with people who are trying to work through what Marty laid out in the article, how are you helping people do that, or how are you doing it yourself? What are some resources that you're pulling from?
Well, I think that one of the key things that we try to facilitate some conversations. I think that a lot of times that when you're already facing the consequence of this particular instance, you're already feeling isolated. So if you can find ways to open up some opportunities for communication where folks can kind of talk about how they're feeling. So for instance, we're part of a group that's feeding students that normally get free or reduced lunches at school, waiting on the school to be able to pick that up. They just got the waiver where they can continue that, I think, starting next week. But several of the volunteers are teachers. And so when they see, a car come by and they've got one of their students in it, they run out, want to say hi. So when they come back, we're kind of waiting on the next. We have a conversation. We talk about, how are you all handling it? What do you think about the kids? A lot of them, a lot of folks don't realize, for instance, teachers invest so much in these kids, and their whole rhythm, as you described it, is 9 months virtually of being with these children. And while, like any teacher or adult who's spent that long with, a room full of kids is looking for a break, they weren't looking for a break this way. Mm-hmm. They were looking for the normal break. Now they also know that these children are isolated. They can't get out. They can't enjoy the things that they normally do. They don't get to see their friends. So, if you can kind of open up some space for some conversation about it, that's one thing that I think has been very, very helpful. One of the second things that I think you have to do is what you're trying to do here is how can you point to pieces, articles, video clips, those sorts of things that can, help someone not necessarily try to normalize this experience, but to find some normalcy in that. And I think it's one thing Marty's piece does in, the illustration of praying with a couple in the yard where it's raining and they're, got an umbrella. It's not normal in the sense that that's, as he describes it in the article, they're not sitting on the couch in the house, but the normalcy of someone coming and bearing the gift of prayer and relationship is a normalizing thing. And it's not that we want to accept this and say that this is the quote new normal, but for a period of time, it certainly is. And so creating those sorts of occasions where people can go, oh, I can do that. Oh, I didn't know I could do that. And some congregations, I'm going to go out on a limb here and Marty can correct it, but some congregations seem to be a bit more adept at, say, social media or electronic communication than ours. We're used to being together. We're kind of in a natural area. I can say, hey, have you read my email? And they look at me like, no, or, we put that announcement on Facebook or Instagram or we tried to get it out to you. I don't have time for that. But this has actually forced a bit of difference for them. So, we're finding, them more willing what we would call immigrants to technology are being more interested in trying to, now take to participate. So I got a children's teacher that I talked to today, preschool teacher, and they're trying to get their minds around the difference between an Amazon page and an Amazon group, and it can be confusing. And what can you do in a page, and why do you have a group, and that sort of thing. And then and then these folks are making videos they would have never thought to make for children in their class and post. So they've done that because they've heard people say. They've seen illustrations. Someone's prompted them, and I think so. What you're doing, back to that, what you're doing, trying to provide some resources, is one of the things I think that helps in this particular time.
Yeah, just really trying to name this thing, right? So it's like hanging over us, and we're feeling it, and I think we're kind of carrying this latent grief that's there, that you can't really talk about because everybody's going through the same thing. But if you can say, it's okay to be disappointed about these things. That's what struck such a chord with me in Marty's article, was that he named the things that we're dealing with, not being able to go in the house and sit there and, standing there in the rain with the umbrella. I did some visits over the weekend where I was walking my dog and found church members who were close and just went to their house and knocked on the door and stood out in the yard and we just talked, but it wasn't closed, but I could see them, and just things like that. Marty, you say, there's one thing that you say here is that we did not expect, or we did not experience the fullness of the grace of God until we recognize that it is his glory that casts shadows in the valley of death. He's not distant, but near. We do not grieve like those who have no hope, but grieve nonetheless, even as on the other side of that grief is the grace of God that envelops us, redeeming our grief and loss in the power, or in the glory of his power. And, I think people are dealing with grief in different ways. Some of them are just trying to push through and, hey, let's keep meeting as a church. Let's keep doing stuff. And we're kind of seeing how that's ending up. Some folks have this temporary mentality. It's like, well, it's just for a couple of weeks. I don't really want to embrace the technology, or I'm not going to get used to this. This will be over with soon. But now we're seeing this could be going on for a while, and the grief will hit different people, in different ways. And so for some of us who are trying to process it early, or so we can help others, but then, some folks might not be even realizing what's going on for another week. And then it kind of hits us. How do we kind of see that as this is staggered out? It isn't like 9/11 when, on that day we all sat glued to our TV and it all hit us at once. This is something people have been in denial. People have been thinking it might not be that bad. Well, maybe we'll be back in a couple of weeks, but now it's like this rolling disaster, and then the job losses and all those things that come. How do how can we prepare to help people who are all at different places in this, I guess?
I think for those of us who are in the States, there's nothing within most of our living memory that even comes close to what we're dealing with now. So if you talk to people who are alive, for instance, during World War II, and in certain areas of the country, they had to turn their lights off by a certain time at night so they wouldn't attract, enemy bombers or whatever. But mainland, other than, of course, the bombing of Pearl Harbor, mainland United States, it was mostly business as usual. But if you think about Europe, the Blitzkrieg of London, I mean, they were being bombed every night and getting up and going to work every morning if they survived it. So what we're having is it's really we're talking about flattening the curve, which is great for the virus, but what we're really doing is we're extending the grief period too. And so what you rightly point to 9/11, but what were we told after 9/11? Hey, go shopping, carry on. If you don't go shopping, then Al-Qaeda wins. So we went shopping, and we were sending people overseas and have been ever since, sending people overseas to fight a war, and that affected almost none of us at home unless we knew somebody personally or their family. So we're stretching out a grief period in a way that I don't know that we've ever done before. Maybe the end of the Vietnam War was similar to this in some ways, but certainly most of us who are 50 and under have never experienced a grief period like this. So I think we have to process it as it comes. So to Paul's point, you can really only process one period of grief at a time. The weird thing about this is in 15 or 20 years or 30 years, his daughter is going to be telling her kids this story. And how she tells it'll be up to her, of course, but this period will become all of our personal history, and we'll be telling it for years and years and years in the way that World War II survivors tell their, the ones that tell us their stories tell, or, vets in some other arena. So it's I think we have to get ready on the other side to process in a way that we can tell these and I don't want to say learn because that always sounds so flippant, but that we can benefit from the experience personally in every way that we can.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was talking with my son and with my daughter last night, and he was born 10 days after 9/11. His whole life he's grown up, with the war on terror, going around him. Obviously, didn't know anything about it as a baby, but that's still the context he grew up in. And now his graduation from high school is being marked by this global pandemic. And I was just talking with him about how is that context for your life so far, all your formative years, going to shape you, and what types of things will this next generation do? How will they look at problems and issues differently than our generation did? And I don't like to get too much into the generational stuff. I kind of think that's baby boomers who are trying to make everybody a generation. But at the same time, there is something to it in the sense of what shapes you, informs you, and just kind of how they might see things differently. And then for the church too, we're all pastors and church leaders, and in 3 weeks' time, the whole church in America went from meeting in person to going digital, and things that have been talked about for a long time. Just about everybody who's watching this will be in my church or in other churches. What do you think is going to happen with the future of the church from this? This might go on for a month or two directly, and then maybe in a hybrid way for months after this, as some people can't come back and we kind of keep doing a lot of these things. How do you kind of see the future of the church changing?
I'm going to punt that with Todd if nobody called it.
I saw Paul about to too. So
yeah, well, one of the things that I thought of is
you're not actually in the church, by the way. This is
yeah.
He's the only
correct. Correct. I'm in my bedroom,
okay.
But this is what my bedroom looks like. So,
good.
I remember back 25 years or so ago when I was doing a chaplaincy internship at a local hospital, and one of my assignments was the intensive care unit. I was in my mid-20s, and I didn't even know what I didn't know at that point. And I remember sitting with a man whose mom had just passed away in the ICU. She was probably in her 90s because he looked like he was in his at least late 60s. And we sat in the family waiting room very uncomfortably because I felt like I needed to know what to say, and I didn't. I just didn't have words for him. And so I didn't say anything. I just really sat with him for most of the time. And I don't know if he was uncomfortable, but it was really uncomfortable for me because I just had this tension that I need to be able to say something that helps this man out in a really difficult time. And after about 30 minutes, the doctor had come in and he said, okay, we have your mom ready. You can go in and see her if you'd like. And before he left, he turned to me and just said, thank you. I want to thank you for just being here with me. It's meant a lot. And I think as I thought about that in relation to where we are right now, I was thinking that, for those of us who either are or have been in ministry, we want to jump to how can I help the people around me navigate their way through this. And I think it might be important for us to just be with them in it and not necessarily have the answer for them, but to let them know that, hey, I'm struggling with you. And I mean, you've already mentioned, Alan, that you're going through some of these emotions yourself. I am. And it may be that we just say, we're all dealing with this and let's get through this together. And I don't have a great answer for you. And I don't know what tomorrow is going to look like. I don't know what the church is going to look like. I don't know the answer to those things. I just know that we're here together, and that one of the things that God did to help us in our condition was to come and be with us. Emmanuel is God with us. And now that we're his body in the world, maybe a big part of our job right now is to just be with them.
That's good. That's really good.
Well, I can't now offer something now that he said that we're not supposed to answer that question, Yeah, what I was going to say is really trails right along with that. And that is that, if there is anything that I think will come out of it, what the shape and, for instance, how would a church like ours, for instance, go from having a relative small percentage of people connecting in new technologies, will there be some lingering realization that we can keep up, and that what replaces it is not a coronavirus but busy lives, and that sometimes we haven't stopped long enough to recognize that there are ways we can stay in contact. We don't have to take the 3-month summer vacation, even if we are going to take a 3-month summer vacation. But I think that really the thing I look at and say, in addition to where Paul ended, was, be with. I think there's going to be at least a realization that, I think Marty put it this way: one of the benefits, let's put it that way, one of the benefits of the experience will be, I think, a return to the value of being present. And I don't mean that somehow we're going to see a return to the increased church attendance of the 70s or the idealistic vision of what church attendance was like in the 50s after World War II. What I mean is I think people are going to have had long enough to pause to think, I miss being with people. And there's a certain group of people I miss being with. And it doesn't mean that all of a sudden when things return to some sense of normal, whether that's 4 months or 9 months, depending on if we have a second wave, but it will be that the addition back into their lives will include, I think, maybe a little bit more intentionality, even if it's not what we would call as pastors and church leaders, more regular. I think it will be more intentional, even if it returns to the same sort of scheduling. But, listen, there is something about watching my daughter today. When we went out and started our project, Porch Pics. So she's a great photographer, and I drove the van around, and we went to 4 church members' homes to start this. We've got about 40 plus families that have said, "Hey, we'll do it." And we hit people who are, having to work from home, who are retired. And, to see her at our last stop get out and try to figure out, how do I express presence with this lady who adopted me when I was like 7 or 8 as one of her own, who has been Granny Barb to her for as long as she's got a memory. And I got to confess right here in front of you and whoever is going to listen, she couldn't stand it. So she just said, I've got to have a hug. And to see her embrace Barbara the way she did, well, talk about tears. It's like that really for me was kind of what I'm trying to get at. I think that sort of sense is going to be what will be a consequence here. It's like, God, flesh and blood people, I get to, and I think that gives us an occasion to point to the incarnation. And I don't mean we go, we stand up in a pulpit and go, well, now the lesson is we get to, talk about the incarnation. I just think that when we want to point back to what is incarnational about our living, this is going to be a moment where we can say, I know what it's not. It's not, over airwaves and video screens and laptops and cell phones. It's going to be somebody, a person, And I think that's what John's trying to do in the Gospel of John. It's a person, and so whatever else we've done, I think the church will at least, again, Marty's will benefit from a return to the realization that it's people. We've been trying to tell people it's not programs and all that sort of stuff for a long time, but this is a real kind of occasion to say, see?
That's a really good point.
Yeah. Well, as we get close to wrapping up, I want to ask the big question that's kind of looming over us. 100,000, 200,000, 240,000, whatever it might be, if we all work really hard at this over the next, 6 weeks, couple of months. Once those things start to hit and, this isn't, someone, die in a car wreck that's unexpected, cancer that has been expected. These are people that we're hearing stories of, if they get sick and 5 days later, and it's just kind of almost out of nowhere for people. Ellis Marsalis, the jazz legend in New Orleans, who I've listened to his music for years, passed away from this yesterday. We're going to start hearing stories of people we know, of celebrities, of leaders, and that's going to hit us, and it's going to impact us in ways. Marty, you said in your article, grief and loss are endemic to our earthly sojourn, even if pandemics are not. Grieving is the gift that helps us process through tragedy and loss. The Bible never commands us to keep a stiff upper lip. Instead, we are instructed, weep with those who weep and mourn with those who mourn. How do we process the grief? And I do think back to World War II, and I wasn't alive then, but just hearing stories from grandparents, and and then even going back to like the Civil War, where the roll sheet would be read in the town square of the sons of the county who had died in a battle, and we'll be getting some of that. How do we process that, and how do we do that day by day? Marty, what were you thinking when you wrote that?
I think to go back to Todd's point, it goes to our humanity. It goes to our frailty. We're constantly being reminded that death is an enemy, not an enemy that hasn't been overcome in Christ, but an enemy nonetheless. I think that's one of the things I say at almost every funeral that I do, is the reason it hurts so bad is because death is an enemy. We do have a tendency to emphasize the good that will come, the resurrection, so much that we almost push aside the bad that has come. We recognize the old saying, death is a doorway, sure, but you got to die to get through it. And so, relationships are ruptured. And so, I know 6 people personally who have been diagnosed. Thankfully, they're all getting better. It doesn't look like it's going to be fatal for them. But we are seeing younger people apparently die. A pastor in New York just found out had died after they didn't cancel services, apparently, and one of his members was sick and infected pretty much the entire church. So these things are going to hurt, and I think our response to them is that we hurt. We don't pretend like it doesn't hurt, and we don't try to scripture quote the pain away. We embrace the moment and endure with a hope that there is light on the other side of the shadow. And that's the only way that I think that I know to get through it as a believer. We're in a dual role, and pain is part of that. And so weeping comes for the night, or lasts for only the night, and joy comes in the morning. Both are real. And I think we have to let both of them be real.
Mm-hmm. Eugene Peterson talks about practicing resurrection, and about the church being the colony of heaven and the country of death. And, we have Easter coming up next week, and normally, we put on our Easter clothes and take pictures out in front of the church, and, we have all this, wearing dresses, and, not us, the 4 of us, but we go through this thing with Easter dinner and family get together, Easter egg hunts, and it's a joyful time, and now we're going to have this this kind of hanging over us. But I'm just really trying to press in and talk with my church and church leaders about the cross still happened, the resurrection still happened, and even though we're going through this, how do we embrace this moment while at the same time the historical fact of the resurrection that we put our hope in is greater than this, and so I don't know, Todd and Paul, and we'll finish up here because I was wanting to keep this not an hour, but do you have any thoughts about how we practice resurrection in the midst of this darkness and gloom that's over us?
Go ahead, Todd.
Silence.
Yeah, I think practicing resurrection is I love the phrase, and I guess we have to reckon with the realities that we've already died. And that's the formula Paul gives us. And so if we've already died, the idea of practicing resurrection is practicing what does that look like, knowing we've already died. And Paul gives a number of illustrations in Romans. He in chapter 8, one of our the texts for last Sunday, described the reality that our mind is set on the Spirit, and there's life and living, and I mean, it's interesting that it actually happened to coincide with the passage in Ezekiel 37 with dry bones, and the John 11 passage with Lazarus. And here you have okay, so let's practice. What does that look like? And I mean, if we're going to actually think through it, while we look at it as a historical event, certainly Jesus died, point in time, punctiliar, it happened. When he says to Martha, I am the resurrection and life, that's present tense. So the present realities are, he knew what it was to already be dead, because he had made the commitment to be dead, if that makes any sense. So from there, everything he did from there was literally, I mean, if that was part of the mission to defeat sin and death for us, then his commitment was, he knew that would result in his death. Maybe not how, if depending on how you want to work out Jesus' humanity. I'm not really here to talk about, try to work that theological apparatus out. But what you have to take into account is, from the point that he began his ministry, he knew he was dead. So to say I'm present tense, I am the resurrection, means to have already died, at least the commitment to. So how do we practice it? Well, I hate to say, I don't want to use the old tried and true, what would Jesus do? I think maybe we probably should change it and do what he did. Mm-hmm. That leaves it without the subjective. I've got to decide what he would do. Instead, I probably got a whole lifetime to try to do what he did. And so that would be kind of, for me, maybe how I would try and encourage practicing resurrection. We've died. And depending on, even no matter your denominational framework and how you locate baptism is the description of, you've died. We've been buried with Christ. We're dead. Now let's go live. And so I think that's how I would kind of frame that.
Anything to add to that, Paul, or any thoughts?
No, I mean, I think that's a good, a great summary.
Good deal. Well, Marty, thank you for prompting our thinking with this article. I'll put a link to it in the on the YouTube page that so people can check it out and share it. And this was fun. This was probably the biggest reason why I contacted you guys to talk through this, is so that I could talk to you. And
I wish you would give an altar call so I could see Paul go forward.
I'm already at the front.
Well, it kind of looks like he's in the baptismal font right now.
Right in the middle of it, yeah.
Yeah, it's liturgical church. So anyway.
Yeah, good job on the article, Marty. Really good.
Yeah.
Really well done.
Yeah.
Well, maybe we can do this again as this goes on. I'm sure we'll have more to talk about. So this might be a good thing to pick up again and check in with you guys and see what you're thinking as we process. So
good. Thanks, Alan.
Yeah, thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you.